Trauma Therapist Podcast, episode 518. All right, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. My name is Guy McPherson. My mission is to raise the awareness of trauma and to support and inspire new trauma therapists just starting out on the trauma-informed journey. I do that with my membership community, Trauma Therapist 2.0, my online courses and workshops, and the Trauma Therapist newsletter. If you're a therapist of any kind and you work with individuals who've been impacted by trauma, I invite you to head on over to my website at thetraumatherapistproject.com. That's thetraumatherapistproject.com. All right, let's get started. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Annie Brooke. Annie, welcome.
Thank you so much.
All right. So Annie is a somatic author, educator, and therapist. She has over 35 years of professional experience helping infants through adults resolve trauma. She teaches courses online, the difference between shock and trauma, and she's launching a 10-week healing complex trauma course April 7th. And he has worked at Children's Hospital and the Child Trauma Centers, in public schools, with gang youth, with sexually abused foster children, and she's seen families and adults in private practice since 1978. All right, Annie, just a little bit about you. Before we get going here, share with our listeners where you're from originally and
Okay.
where you're calling from currently. We'll get going.
I'm currently calling from Boulder, Colorado, where
cool.
I live.
Okay.
And I grew up basically in South Florida. My dad was in the Air Force, so we moved around when I was a young child. But my major kid growing up years were in a wonderful place in South Florida with lots of nature and swimming and all that. So
Nice.
I was very fortunate.
Nice. All right. So you've been doing this for a while. How the heck did you get into this field?
This was not where I thought I'd end up. I did not think, I'm going to school to become a therapist. I actually dropped out of college and became a little back to the land pioneer, built a log cabin with a friend, and we had a water-powered furniture business. I went to Scotland and became apprenticed in pottery. So I thought I was having that life as a stoneware potter. And then a lot of trauma hit. My partner started drinking, which I didn't know about. And then the house burned down. My animals were killed. Yeah, it was major. And of course, you're at that fresh, young, building your home and loving the land and making the garden, So in that process, I was very loyal. So I got a job on a fishing boat off Cape Cod to earn some money. And then we built a second house. And then I realized I am not doing well. There is the trauma of the house fire, of all the effort, of someone who now had a substance abuse. And I just felt like if I stay here, I'm going to die.
How old were you at this time, Annie?
I was 23, maybe.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yep, 23. And, so luckily I went home to Florida for my sister's wedding, and my other sister was visiting from California, and she took one look at me and she said, "You need to come out here to California and learn how to meditate."
And let me just interrupt you. Can you release the microphone part of your headphone from your sweater? There you go.
Okay, that'll be much easier to hear.
Thanks so much. Yeah, we're just rubbing on that thing.
Okay, let's see if I can keep that out of the way.
That's fine. Yeah.
All right, good. We'll try that.
Sorry to interrupt you.
That's okay. So I luckily, I was in this place where I couldn't hardly hold a job. I could feel my mental capacity. It was as if my brain were unraveling. And later that gave me some good perspective about mental health. It's like when there's too much stress, the brain stops functioning so well. And I grew up in a good family, lots of, I'll go back to those stories because those were part of what shaped me for sure. But the part of it that was really important in that moment is I found myself in California. I had just a little tiny suitcase. Everything else had burned up. And I went to this school for meditation that taught Sufi-based meditation. I didn't need medication, which was really good. I went the natural route. And my sister helped me get into this school, which basically was open to anyone. And it was teaching you Sufi practices, how to meditate, organize your energy. And at the time, this was in 1978. So this was before energy medicine was talked about or worked with. But I had so much integration. And at the same time, I joined a 4-year training called Healing Ourselves, which used a combination of, it worked with the emotional body. So we
Mhm.
worked with Wilhelm Reich's Neo-Reichian, or the breath sessions. So we were doing the mat work and processing emotions and bioenergetic. And I got exposed to group process.
Mm.
So all of a sudden, there's these tools of dialogue and expression and release. And I felt like I was coming back to life because I think with all that trauma, I just numbed out. My heart numbed, my whole experience numbed, and the movement and the container of tools, somatic tools and meditation tools. I was so lucky because it takes a while to come out of shock. And when you have big events, they do shock our system. And then you're like walking in the world in a different reality than other people.
How did your house burn down?
My partner was I was in Florida at the time for visiting for Christmas, and my partner forgot to shut down the furnace, and it started a fire. And he was down working at the mill and saw these huge flames.
Mm.
And by the time he could get up there and get the fire department, there was only, spruce logs are very flammable.
Mm.
So it was he was used to me being in the home, and I wasn't, because I was on vacation, he forgot, and it was one of those kind of errors.
And you
Yeah.
said, naturally very traumatic. How did that trauma manifest for you?
Oh, well, I guess, I just I just went numb out, and let's build our next house. We've started this project, we have this land. And so I was just sort of functioning on top of the trauma.
Mm.
And it wasn't until I got home for my sister's wedding that and I lived in back at home for a couple months before I went to California. I started to decompensate, and people should know about this. You can function after trauma, but eventually it's going to catch you. Eventually the process of the healing is is part of the fog, or the not being able to hold a conversation. That's kind of how it showed up. And then when I moved to California, I kept moving in and out of shared housing and I wouldn't decorate my room. I just had a
Mm.
sleeping bag on the floor. Now, what does that tell you, right? Luckily, I had all these other things where I was in these healthy groups doing group process. I had not only the spiritual work from the meditation and the emotional movement work from the healing ourselves, but I was so fortunate I started studying improvisational theater and contact improvisation. So I felt like, for the grace of God, I got exposed to sort of body, mind, spirit,
Mhm.
learning and integration. And as I started to get more and more healthy, my mind basically, I learned how to not be in the prefrontal cortex. Now in my work, I know all the neuroanatomy, I know the brain, I know the neuroscience behind what was helping me way back then. At that time, all we talked about was learning how to sit in the center of your head. And we did meditation practices of put your attention in your knee, put it in your elbow. So these shifting attention, so you weren't stuck in a trauma loop. You weren't refreshing the past always, but it was clearing the field. And then luckily, because I was doing the meditation and the emotional release and the group process and the play of contact improv and movement, I was working all my channels.
Aside from your sister recommending the meditation, were there other people pointing you to these other channels, or was it just your instinct?
It was, she kind of gave me some ideas of what was out there, and then it was my instinct for sure.
Okay.
You
So
know,
how do things unfold such that you're like, all right, I want to be a therapist?
well, basically, it started to happen that I had to make a living, of course, right? And so I thought, oh, I'm finally moving in my body, and I want to be a dancer. And then I realized I can't do what dancers do, and I was sort of mad about that. You know, here I am getting healthy, and I started with the meditation, having these sort of things just manifest. We would do visualization practices, and I ended up, going to this performance where we did a month long of improvisational, 8 hours a day performance. And what happened is at the graduation, I got a ride in a little sports car up, to the beach. And then I started seeing little sports cars everywhere. And then I found one for $300 from a friend who was selling it. Things would just unfold, a kind of synchronicity.
Mm.
And that is sort of how I ended up. Well, I did make a choice to be a therapist because I thought, gosh, it looks like I can't be a dancer. My body doesn't know the skills that
Mm.
dancers have. And I was disappointed. And I thought, well, I want to be able to, do something that's creative. And I thought, I'm going to become a body centered psychotherapist. I mean, it wasn't that defined, but I started offering sessions. And that was back in the day. It was in 79 that people would come to the school. I taught at the clairvoyance school. Like, I went through their program, and then I taught the meditations. And that was such a learning because I saw everybody can learn this. It doesn't matter if they're a doctor, a plumber, a carpenter, a mom. Given the tools, people's brains open and their experience shifts and they find themselves. And I was so passionate about that. So I volunteered at Children's Hospital to work with the trauma children. And people were asking me for individual sessions when I taught at the school. So that started my work. And so then I got a little office and I started doing the Neo-Reichian sessions that I was learning in this 4-year training. And I saw the results people were getting. So it was kind of this following my nose, following what was working for me, and the desire to share, and also the desire to, be able to afford my food. And so I thought, well, this is a good career because as a woman, I can earn as much. There's not a glass ceiling around, back in the day there, the salaries between men and women. As a therapist, you're in charge of your salary. And so those were all of the factors. There was practical and also heartfelt, what really helped someone come out of. I mean, I really was afraid I was going to become homeless, the way my brain was working prior to getting those tools. And so that's not fun to go through.
Right, right. So it
Yeah.
sounds like you were addressing your trauma through a lot of somatic work,
Mm-hmm.
uh, really before the importance of, I think, right, the
It
somatic.
was before somatic was
Yeah.
even known about. It was
Well,
Tom.
especially the association between, or the importance of working with somatically in trauma before
Yeah.
that even association had been forged.
Yeah. And I was lucky. I think I got the first somatic psychology degree in the country. I went to Antioch and I said, look, I want to create my bachelor's degree. I had dropped out of school years earlier before I did my pioneer work in Maine. And so I put together all the things I was studying and created a degree called Somatic Psychology. And
Wow.
that was in 1980, I think. And, they didn't really have a degree like that, but I was able to. Antioch supports your own learning.
Mm.
And I had so many, skillful mentors. And then I went to JFK graduate school to get my master's in psychology. And both of my professors looked at me and said, you are thriving, already doing what you're wanting to learn. And they sort of talked me into dropping out. They said, you're doing the work. You don't need us. If it were different, we would say something different. And I was like,
Mhm.
okay, feet on the ground. That's how it got started.
Very interesting, what you're talking about, what I'm noticing. I mean, obviously you're a very just creative person. Um, I'm
Mhm.
curious. This might seem out of left field, but I'm curious about the pottery. I mean, you have artist hands. I can see them. I
Uh,
recognize them.
yeah.
Are you still doing pottery?
Oh, I want to. I hope as I get towards more retirement possibility, I'll go back to pottery. But I'm not doing pottery. I'm doing painting and I'm doing singer-songwriting.
Uh-huh.
So I have a little, I've been working with my instruments and music. And so, yeah, but I have used my hands all my life, and that's key too.
Yeah. So it's one thing, to have experienced your own trauma, gone through that and your own healing process, but it's another thing too to begin working with people who've also been traumatized. What was that like for you?
Well, I didn't think of people as traumatized. I really just thought of them as people, and that I, had some skills I could share. And I think I first started sort of in when I lived back in Maine, I taught a yoga class, so I got enjoying teaching. And then when I taught at the meditation school, I loved that.
Mm.
And I was using movement and meditation. I called my class I'm forgetting the name. Oh, so it was about body connection. So we did body awareness and movement and breath. And then we would sit down and do personal inquiry.
Hmm.
Like, how do you handle your life when we were working with the sensations of the hand? When I was working with the eyes, how do you see yourself? So I was always making the link for people between their experience and their understanding.
Mm.
And so then I was fortunate to get jobs, the experience working with the children at Oakland's. That was a volunteer job, but I got to work with the children. And when you can apply your learning and you see the benefit, oh my gosh, that's what really set me on the path of my career. I got to work in, mental health centers. I worked with foster children, and I learned so much. It wasn't just I sat in my little pedestal of my office and doled out, treatment. It's like I really got the great experience of feet on the ground, working with hard populations, real difficult life situations. And every time the same skills worked: presence, embodiment, compassion, and education. And I really think therapy is primarily education to help clear out the brain that's latched onto the trauma, the body mind.
Hmm.
And I was so fortunate that I was uh, in the movement arts, because that led me to Bonnie Bainbridge Cohen's work and continuum work, where you literally, with Bonnie's work, you learn the developmental process, how the brain develops from infancy. And so I went back and crawled as a grown up. I went back and reshaped my own experiences, because I didn't know it at the time, but I read the book The Magical Child when I was 27 by Clinton Pierce. And because I was in the 4-year Healing Ourselves, I did my, tantrum about realizing I was not with my mom after birth. I was in an incubator. And I knew I was sort of a challenged kid in that as a younger child, I was high arousal temper tantrum. And my mom didn't know what to do with me. My father passed away when I was 2.5, and she had 3 young kids. So she had been a social worker and went back to school for early childhood education. And fortunately, she taught us crafts and art. And then she moved us all to South Florida so we could be around nature. And her instinct to do that, I think, really helped me because nature helped me manage. But I
Mhm.
remember I had this, needing to be perfect. And I didn't understand that till years later. I'm doing my understanding of the earliest impressions, pre and perinatal, which is the study of 0 to 18 months precognitive impressions. And so I was back in, the anger and the understanding of what did I go through in the incubator? What did I go through not knowing where my mother was right when I was born? How did that shape my temper tantrums and high arousal? So I had, it was almost like I was a living laboratory of my studies. And so and when I was 8, my mother, I remember I was playing, street softball with the neighbors, and the pitcher struck me out, and he was my friend from across the street. As soon as I struck out, I was so mad, I went up and started punching him. And my mom just took me off the street and put me in my room and said, "You don't come out till you don't have a temper." And oh my gosh, it took about 3 hours.
Wow.
I remember jumping from bed to bed, so furious. But she gave me limits.
Mhm.
And sometimes parents don't know how to do that. That's why I have this free download in my library, my PDF of about 1, 2, 3 magic. It's not my work, but it's the very effective support for parents so they're not overridden by the children, but actually helping contain the children so they feel safe. And parents always say, wait, we're not supposed to give limits. We're supposed to allow our child's expression. And I would say yes, and I learned that children don't feel safe without limits when I worked with the sexually abused foster children. Because I was the creative music director, and I was giving them all this music and freedom, and they would kick at me and spit on me. And it wasn't until I got like, wait a minute, this is not working. And so I started setting limits and being real, and they started bonding with me. It's like the whole nature of they settled, they felt safe because they couldn't they couldn't, be mean.
Right.
They were no longer able to be the bully or be the abuser. And I was like, no, I'm here with you. And so that was an incredible learning of how to help be with children, really be present with children.
Let me ask if you could share an early clinical error slash
Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. Oh, I'm so sorry. I still send this child blessings. I was working as a therapist in the public schools, and I had, my background and my years of experience, and I was hired to be the therapist and help the children. And this one school was this little girl, and she was going to get, kicked out if she didn't behave. And so they had me working with her, and we were out in the hallway, and I got enrolled in a power struggle. And it really taught me how you have got to pay attention about power struggles with children and with your clients and in life in general. Because all of a sudden, I was using my authority power with her, and she was using her too bad for you power back with me.
Mhm.
We were just in a power struggle. And I kind of, I couldn't hold the compassionate space. I got triggered and got mad. And I said, we're marching back into the classroom, and I was aggressive with her, and I really regret that.
So what should you have done, I guess, specifically?
Well, I think now, I think I maybe needed to get another person to help me, because this was also an ethnic difficulty. The child was Native American, and she was in the public school, and she didn't want to be there. And she sure didn't want to hear anything from a white Caucasian therapist trying to help her.
Mhm.
Right. So that was sort of the thing I didn't realize from the beginning. I mean, now I really pay attention to all that, but I was just so oh, I've got some tools, let's help. So I should have slowed everything way down, and I should have just sat down against the wall and not said a word with her. Just stayed out in the hall and just waited,
Right.
not forced anything, but just waited to see what could unfold.
Right. Right. Appreciate you
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yeah.
Let me just remind everyone that I'm speaking with Annie Brooke, and just mention your website here is anniebrooke.com. That's ANNIEBROOK.com. And I'll have that linked up at the show notes page here at the Trauma
Thank you so
Therapist. You're
much. Yeah.
welcome. Traumatherapistpodcast.com. So, as I said, you've been obviously doing this for a while, and it seems to me like you bring so much of your being to this work. When you talk to, or maybe you don't talk to, but if you could talk to younger therapists just starting out,
Mm-hmm.
and specifically who, want to work with people who've experienced trauma, what would you
Mm-hmm.
say to them?
Do your inner work. And I do mentor therapists. I have training programs for therapists because I want people to have the skills I have, because
Mm-hmm.
they really, really work. And when you go back and you heal all the way to even your own birth, or your own life events, when you're not in shock or you're not overriding your natural embodied intelligence, you're a better therapist. You can stay present. And I also say, don't be just simply a listening therapist. Use movement, give interventions that reinform the brain and the body. So if you just talk, or you just empathize, you don't have the person down on the ground pushing or feeling their own embodiment. So then you're working too hard as a therapist because you don't have the potency in the room for change to happen. So I use a lot of body-based interventions based on infant development or perceptions of sight and sound and touch. And I've seen such results. Like one kid, I was teaching in Switzerland for a while, and I only saw this child one time, and the dad brought him in, and we didn't even speak the same language. But I realized from what the dad was saying is that the kid couldn't focus in school. And my first thought was, I bet he doesn't feel his own body on some level. And there's a lot of people who use their bodies but don't feel them. And so I did levering through the bone, the touch hands-on, where I would take his upper arm and I would hold it and pull out the slack, give it a little tension, and then feed it into his skeleton. And you could see the light bulbs in his eyes. It's like, oh my gosh. And all of a sudden he was there. And I just, I feel like crying. It's like, oh, sometimes it's that simple. Now, I would say, I do have touch training. I use educator touch in psychotherapy, which is not always clinically approved of, but I have a touch license and I have people sign a touch contract. That means they can always say no. They will talk about it. If there's a distress, we will talk about it. So it's never this schmoozy kind of touchy thing. Because it is delicate. And I also know enough about shock that you don't go near a traumatized person until you've cleared the shock in the field and there's a relational safety. And I would this is what I would say to new therapists, don't be a do-gooder, because people come in to help. And I tell you, when I worked with the gang kids, and I would be working with a 16-year-old guy that could have thrown me across the room, and another therapist would come in and get too close to him spatially. And so the kid didn't, knew that therapist was putting the client in danger, because he would, have a blowout because the therapist wanted to help so much. She was ignoring his spatial boundaries. And these are things you have got to know about as a therapist. Sometimes I will sit not opposite a client because we're in a sagittal plane, and that's sometimes a plane of confrontation. So I'll pull my chair up beside them, and all of a sudden they relax. or I'll have them, if they can't, if they're thinking, I'll give them movement practices that actually interrupt and open the back of the brain. So my book, From Conception to Crawling, has lots of those resources. And then I wrote a book called Help for Sensory Challenges. Because if your client is not perceiving, and those perceptions are not functioning well, they go into shock, or they're in their head, or they're in their body, but they can't feel anything. I've seen it all, really. And you kind of have to be a good detective. What is this person doing? How are they expressing? What is their internal sense of self, sense of safety? And here's where I want to say infants can make up identity beliefs. Now that's amazing. But I worked with a 6-year-old who was in the incubator. She came in because she was having meltdowns in school. She brought a little card she made, and on every page it said, bad baby. Little baby in a box with tears, bad, bad baby. And I thought, oh no, how can this be? She had a good family. Why does she think a baby is bad? And I thought about it for, I really had to think about it, like, okay, bad things are happening. She has no locus of control. That's what an incubator experience is like. And the way to organize the nervous system so you don't die of terror because of chaos, and not being able to orient to the mother at night or the father, she would self-attack. And so now I have a whole program of teaching people about self-attack thinking. The brilliance of the nervous system primitive level is it keeps the fight response going when you feel endangered, and it keeps a locus of control, like self exists. And if you're too overwhelmed, you can go into existential shock and not even know if you exist. And that's why when you're treating, you want to know, am I treating shock or trauma? Am I treating someone who has a masochist protection body pattern, or do they have a schizoid where they fragment and scatter? So I want to know how. One of my favorite tools is the hula hoop. I have an imaginary hula hoop, and I want the client to be able to feel their spatial self, their physical self, a sense of safety and protection. And sometimes people have never known protection, so they're not going to want to come into the body. I worked with a 10-year-old whose mom brought him to me because he wouldn't put on sunscreen. And in Colorado, that's not so great. And I was working in a warm pool. That was part of my treatment method when I had a pool. And with this kid, I was floating him, and the water is a good way to feel the body. And I was floating him, and I thought, I don't really feel like you're in your body. So I asked him, I said, hey, do you think you're in your body? And he said, no, I'm on the ceiling watching you. And I was like, I thought so.
Wow.
And so I said, okay, let's play a game. You tell me when you think you're in your body. So I was using movement with him through the water and having him put his attention on himself and his body. And finally he said, I think I'm there. And I said, yeah, I can feel it.
Wow.
And that kind of reflection, if the therapist can provide that kind of education and compassion, people heal.
Right.
You don't want clients for years and years.
Right.
You want a good referral base, and you want to do good work, but you want to help people heal.
All right, Bonnie, as we wind down here, what's the best way for people to learn about you and your work? Because I think a lot of listeners are going to be listening to this going, oh my gosh, how do I find out what this woman knows?
Well, the simple way is to follow me on Instagram.
Okay.
I share little quick tools, and it's just Instagram.com/Annie Brooke Therapy.
Okay.
That's one way. And then Fridays, every Friday, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, I do a Facebook Live.
Oh, cool.
Where I do somatic practices, and I love sharing them.
Oh, nice.
Now, if people want the online courses and the real studies, you can get my books. I don't know if you can see them, but I have a bunch of books.
Okay. And again, I'll have those linked up here at the show notes page.
Thanks.
Yep.
And I love teaching in these online courses. I lead some, they're evergreen, so you could always take them, but I lead them live. different courses.
Right.
And so get with me. Ideally, after COVID, I'll be teaching in person again.
Right.
But in the meantime, come and study, because you can learn these things. And once you get your, training wheels on enough about embodiment, because it is an immersion, then you can apply all these. And I can tell you, I have successfully run a 2-year training program, and I have people out there doing the work, and they come to me for supervision.
Awesome.
And
Awesome.
that's what I want to do, is get more and more therapists out there doing the good work.
Well, you are certainly one inspiring individual. I love chatting with you today.
Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time. Awesome. Well, Annie, I want to thank you so much for jumping on here, and it was great
And
chatting.
I'm glad for what you're doing, just helping people get resources. It's really how we all heal. So
Awesome.
thank you too.
You're welcome. Take care. Be well.
All right. Bye for now.